Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to talk about a wonderful novel by Michael Frayn called Spies. Now, Spies was published in 2002 and Michael Frayn himself is an Englishman. He was born in 1933, so he's of course getting on in years right now. And his latest novel was already 13 years ago, that's 2012, and that was called Skios, a comic novel, quite well done, but perhaps not at the level of some of his other works, and certainly not at the level of Spies. Now, you may know Michael Frayn because he is, in fact, rather well known, at least in England. He's a playwright. He wrote many plays, some of which were huge successes. It was translated in many languages. He is a translator himself, a translator of Russian. And basically there are two types of novels. Perhaps that's a bit stupid maybe to say it like this, but two types of novels in Michael Frayn's work. There is what he is perhaps well known for also, which is the so-called comic novels. And here, comic novels, a masterpiece. It's called Headlong, a wonderful book, extremely funny, but not funny in a stupid, laugh out loud way, of course. And it is extremely well put together. So there is an inner mechanic to the novel, supported by the humor. Wonderful Headlong. The Trick of It is another comic novel. Now you know. So, Trick of It is a very funny novel about set in sort of academia, or more or less academia. And those novels are very funny, but extremely well put together, extremely well written as well, and they work as novels as well as comic novels. The other side, perhaps, of Michael Frayn's work could be said to be more serious, even though it's never purely serious. And here I'm thinking about The Landing on the Sun, for example, The Russian Interpreter, a great little novel as well, very subtle, very quiet, ironic, wonderful little novel. Now, Spies is none of those things in a way, and that's why it's so interesting to talk about. It's also interesting to talk about because it is a masterful novel. Very evocative, poignant at times, very well written, and extremely interesting in itself. And it's also interesting to talk about Spies, as I want to do today, because it exemplifies different aspects of writing and literature in general that are always relevant, I think, when we read. Now, basically, I want to talk about sort of four different things when it comes to Spies. I want to talk about what is very common these days, perhaps, but which took many centuries really to come together, is the mixing of genres and mixing of styles. And why do you do this? Why does Michael Frayn do that? And to what effect? That will, of course, lead us on to talk about craftsmanship, that is, technical writing abilities and the difference those can make or do make, which will lead on to the main theme, perhaps, even though it's always a bit reductive to talk about one theme when it comes to such a wonderful novel. But the main theme, perhaps, is how two worlds can coexist and not really understand each other. And finally, we'll say a quick word about novelists using personal information to create, in what way that can develop, and how that relates, of course, to Michael Frayn himself. So, here we go. Michael Frayn, Spies, 2002 novel. So the first thing we want to talk about is mixing styles and genres. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you all know, of course, different genres, like detective, erotic fiction, science fiction, thrillers, true novels, true life, or all those are, of course, genres, and each of them has a set of tropes that is sort of recurring mechanics, as it were, things that organize the novel. Think about a detective novel, for example. Typically in a detective novel, you will have a mystery to solve, So that propels, of course, the story forward. There will be an investigator. Now you have a whole array of different investigators, of course, but nevertheless, they all fulfill the same role. You will have, witnesses. You will have questions, doubts, red herrings, and all the like. Within that array of tropes, of recurring structural parts or events of a genre, you of course have a wide canvas that you can fill in any way you like. Nevertheless, each genre is related to some techniques and some expectations from us readers. Now, Spies has a very simple premise. It is set in England during the Second World War. In London, in a small area, a small suburb of London, which is, you could say, almost semi-rural. It's caught between the sort of busiest part of London and the fields beyond. And where the action is set is some sort of semi-separate, semi-closed off sort of round area around which houses are distributed. And the narrator, Stephen, is a young teenager. He's 11, 12 maybe. And he is living his life out there with his family. And in that area, he meets a new boy named Keith. And the book really takes off with their friendship taking off. And again, the premise is very simple. At some stage, remember, Second World War, at some stage, Keith, a sort of leading boy, the boy to whom Stephen looks up very much. Keith says to Stephen, my mother is a spy, a German spy. And that is the beginning for the story, because basically Keith and Stephen, the narrator, will go on some sort of quest to find out whether the mother is indeed a spy. And by listening in on her, by spying on the mother, they will in fact uncover a wide sort of distribution of relationships within that very close, small community. And this is, we'll come back to that in a second, this is masterfully done by Michael Frayn. Now, how does Frayn mix genres and styles in that novel? Well, it's pretty simple because, as you can guess from my very brief summary, it is a detective novel. There is a mystery to solve. The investigators are the two boys. The witnesses are the people they talk to try and uncover the truth. And the mystery, whether the mother is a spy, turns out to be a very, very, very different type of mystery, which probably remains a mystery for the boys until the end of the novel. But for us readers, adult readers, we follow the unraveling, the discovery of that mystery at the level of our readership and not at the level of the narrator's readership or perception of events. So basically, Michael Frayn starts off with a sort of semi-autobiographical part. The first few pages are an old man visiting the place. That is the old version of the narrator, Stephen. And that old version of himself visits the place 50 years later. And of course, the memories à la Proust, the memories come flooding back here, just like in Proust, in fact, based on the scent of a certain flower that transports the narrator back in the past. But very quickly, as we understand, it goes from being a semi-autobiographical, wistful look on the past to a sort of period piece, the setting, historical novel, London towards the end of the Second World War, the fear of spies, the fears of Germans, the fear of the bombing and the planes bombing London and all those things. And then, of course, it becomes a real full-on detective mystery novel, but which again functions on two completely different levels. It functions at the level of a detective mystery novel for the boys, which is also the vehicle, of course, for the story as a whole. And on the other level, at our level of adult readers, it functions as a slow revealing of a set of relationships within a certain context, of course, both social and historical context, laying bare the lives of those people at that time. Now, of course, as usual, a genre is only a vehicle for ideas, themes, and nowadays authors will use whichever genre they think fits what they want to do and the way they want to do it. It is not therefore uncommon, it has not been uncommon for quite a few decades now, to see very mainstream writers. You can think about Philip Roth, you can think about Cormac McCarthy, you can think about Margaret Atwood, and there are many, many, many more. And Paul Auster, in fact, is one of his very first novels. And those use tropes from science fiction, speculative fiction, because it enables them, as it has always enabled science fiction writers, to actually put their point across in a different way than they would or could with mainstream literary fiction. And here it's also the same thing. It is a mix of memoir, autobiography, reflecting on the past, period piece, historical novel, psychological novel, families novel, social novel, and mystery. And for that, it is absolutely, of course, first rate. Now, you can only do that really if you have the means to do so. And that's our second point. That is, of course, the craftsmanship that is needed in order to do this. Now, what is craftsmanship in this case? It is quite simply the ability to make use of any technique within the literary writing scope, space, to produce the effects that you want to produce, both on the reader, of course, and on the development of the story. So what do we have here? Well, we have proved that Michael Frayn is an immense writer and an immense craftsman. In a way, for example, he makes use of those double perspectives. So the one that carries the book, the novel, is of course the narrator's perspective. We see the world from his eyes, from his level and his perspective. And what he sees is what an 11-year-old boy sees, of course. He sees people going about their business within a world that is both intimately familiar. He knows everyone, he knows exactly what everybody is doing, where, etc. And completely unknown, because at his age there are too many aspects of human relations that he simply doesn't know about and has never thought about. What is for us, therefore, absolutely fantastically well done as readers is that we realize very quickly that the text always opens itself up to those two levels. We understand that we're following the story through in an 11-year-old boy, but everything that he sees, describes, and understands to us and explains to us, we see, perceive, and understand differently at our level, and we explain it differently at our level. For example, the simplest example, of course, of that kind of a double reading is anything to do with, let's say, sex or extramarital relationships, affairs, or jealousy, or desire. Of course, all those things are completely unfathomable to the narrator, Stephen. He doesn't understand them, he doesn't see them, he doesn't know what that means, and he certainly doesn't know what the psychological effects of all those things can have on the human being. So he never explains relationships between a man and a woman, the way they interact, through that lens. But us, as readers, we see it because we know about it. And therefore it provides us with another layer of interpretation, another vehicle, another lens through which we can look at the story. And this is beautifully done. Right in the beginning, we have this absolutely incredible writing moment where the old narrator, the one who starts the book off, is beginning to be transported back in the past through the scent of that flower I mentioned earlier. And here Michael Frayn starts to blend the pronouns and the tenses, so that for a longish paragraph we are both now at the time of the old narrator and 50 years in the past at the time of the young narrator, the same person, of course, 50 years apart. And this is masterfully done. It's like being in a cinema where the camera would pan out from one face to another and somehow blend the two faces without any transitional moments. It is so smoothly done that this is down to, of course, immense craftsmanship from Michael Frayn, who can produce such effects because he is, of course, very good at writing. Now, this craftsmanship is all in a service of our third point, the main idea of the book, the main theme of the book, and that is that the world of the narrator, Stephen, and his friend, Keith, coexist with the world of the adults, but none of them sees the world the same way. Now, they all look at the same things, they all have the same objects in their hands, they interact with the same people on the same streets, and yet they do not see the same world and they do not understand each other's worlds at all. So this is what this technique is put in service of. It is this idea that the kids look at their parents and who they see are more cardboard people, roles played by people, but they do not see the people behind the face of those parents. In other words, they do not know anything about their own parents. They do not know anything about who those people are, what they want, what they may want, what they're afraid of, except, of course, the Germans and the war, but everybody's afraid of that. Well, the boys not really. It's kind of exciting as usual. But beyond that, any sort of psychological insight into their own parents is quite simply completely absent. And you realize that the parents look at their own children in some also cardboard way. That is, they find it very difficult to penetrate the mind of their own children. In fact, they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about this. And so those two words are side by side, and they interact every day, all the time, and yet they do not see the same things, they do not understand the same things, and they interpret events in a very different way. Now, of course, typically that kind of themes is easily connected to wider questions of identity, but also of knowing the other. Can you ever know the other? Is it ever possible to know the other? There is, of course, this wonderful Patrick Ness young adult novel, The Rest of Us Just Live Here. Wonderful, wonderful novel, which also suggests, of course, that two worlds can coexist and really do not understand each other at all, but they don't see the same things, they don't perceive the same events the same way. Here I have to make a quick mention of Farah Mendelssohn's work, seminal work, I don't know. It was called The Intergalactic Playground, and it's a non-fiction book. It's a critical study of science fiction reading and science fiction text in general. And there are different parts to the book, but one extended part of the book is dedicated to the dichotomy between the worlds that young adult science fiction presents to the reader, which is really hardly recognizable from the real world inhabited by adults. And so, of course, this is not new, but this is in Spies extremely well done. It's so well done that you can't help wondering, but why don't you see it? Why don't you see it? What is it that you don't see? And that's how, of course, you come to realize that you yourself know very little of people around you. And it's very difficult to know who is who, whatever you think you know about them. Now, one possible angle here, and that's our last and fourth and last point, a possible angle here has to do with the use of autobiographical information in novel writing. Now, of course, this is an old saw, because it's well known that in writing courses, aspiring writers are often encouraged to use their own experience, their own life to start and get going, etc. Write about what you know, goes the idea. And this is not the case here. This is not Michael Frayn writing about himself. It has to be important to say. Michael Frayn uses a nugget, a very tiny moment of his own past, to set a story going. He's not writing about himself extensively. That is, the narrator, Stephen, is very obviously, from what Michael Frayn himself said, very obviously inspired by Michael Frayn. Michael Frayn is Stephen. And Keith was a real friend of his in that place which he really lived in. And that Keith in the book is directly taken from the real Keith in the world, as it were. Something that Michael Frayn wrote about very recently in his last book of sort of memoirs, kind of. But that's it. And then what Michael Frayn reveals is that, yes, one day Keith was indeed the leading boy, and Michael Frayn was indeed the sort of following nerd. Keith said to him, "My mother is a spy." Now, Michael Frayn does not remember what happened afterwards. He doesn't remember, he says, that they probably forgot about that 2 hours later and just got distracted by tea and muffins. But that is not the point. The point is that as a writer, he remembers that moment, and he says that he wanted to write about that theme, that separation, that unknowability of the other, and he thought that that would be a good starting point. And off he went, and he wrote that book. Now, of course, we realized then that if that is the case for Spies, it might also be the case for The Russian Interpreter. Again, another of his novels that I highly recommend. Very tiny novel, very delicate, wonderful. And that might, in fact, be the case for the novel that he wrote on the world of journalism, because Michael Frayn was a journalist, worked for the Guardian and the Observer for many years. But the point here, of course, is that this is not somebody using autobiography or autobiographical writing to reflect on himself. This is somebody using a bit of his own history to start something else off. And we have to make the separation, of course, because if you think about somebody like Shalom Auslander, somebody I really very much like, this is obviously somebody writing novels about his own life, or derived from his own life, sometimes at least, to also explore that life, to reflect on that life. There is a cathartic, perhaps, element in Shalom Auslander's work that is not at all the case, I think, in Michael Frayn. And this is good for us to remember, of course, is that there are many, many ways of writing about oneself, or equally many ways of using one's own personal information and history to write novels. Martin Amis is probably another case in recent contemporary English fiction, where we do know that a novel like Success, for example, is at least partially influenced by his own life at that time when he was very young. And it's the same. I mean, I doubt that Martin Amis was working through his early teenage traumas through writing that fiction. I think fiction here was more a way of expressing the real Martin Amis. But again, we have to remember that using what you know or using yourself to write fiction really doesn't have to mean writing about yourself. It can be writing just a memory from a memory and getting off towards something you do want to write about, as opposed to being a prisoner of self-reflection, of course. Now, in conclusion, what can we say? Well, the first thing to say is just go and buy that book and read that book, because you will be delighted. It's a wonderful read. It reads extremely well and easily. Michael Frayn is a very good writer. He is not at all a boring, literary, endless sentences type of writer or hyper-complex things. He keeps things simple, but simple in a way that is evocative, rich, layered, and it transports you somewhere. At the same time, it is also rich in themes and ideas and just observations, and that is what a great, rewarding read has got to be, of course. Provide pleasure in the reading of itself, and provide food for thoughts. Otherwise, what is the point? And that is what Michael Frayn gives us. Spies is a wonderful novel. It's an absolute masterpiece of contemporary fiction. And I hope you enjoy it when you get your hands on it. Thank you. Bye-bye.